Sara and Nina, two friends, had just moved into a college dormitory room in Albany, a building that had been around since the late 1960s and was known for its slightly narrow hallways, uneven floors, and the persistent hum of old fluorescent lights. The building had character, which was what drew them to it, but it also carried a kind of weight, a faint lingering mustiness that no amount of cleaning could entirely remove. From the first night, Sarah noticed small, inexplicable things, though she dismissed them at first, thinking she was simply tired from moving and a long day of unpacking. The desk drawer would be slightly open when she was certain she had shut it. A notebook would be placed at an angle different from the one she left it in, and small items like pens or hair ties seemed to migrate across surfaces without explanation. Nina, practical and logical, often reassured her that the dorms were old, that floors creaked and shifted, and that gravity, drafts, or even unconscious movements could explain these minor occurrences. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something in the room was attentive, like it was aware of her routines, waiting and observing. Over the next few nights, the phenomena grew more precise. Though still subtle, never loud or theatrical, never demanding attention in a dramatic way, but consistent enough to catch Sarah's notice. He began to document everything meticulously, noting the times when her desk lamp flickered even though the circuit breakers were stable, when her computer would freeze sometimes when she was working, or when her phone would capture static or no video recordings of it. The inconsistencies were small but persistent, enough to make her pause, enough to make her question whether her presence in the room had stirred something residual, something tied to the room itself and not her imagination. He discussed her observations with Nina, who remained skeptical, attributing things to quirks of old buildings, human error, or stress. But even Nina began noticing that objects sometimes seemed to shift in ways that could not be reasonably explained. Their backpacks, notebooks, and water bottles would slightly be out of place. Doors that were firmly closed would be unlocked in the morning sometimes, and the faint pressure of being watched would settle over Sarah as she studied. Her focus narrowing unnaturally, her skin prickling in ways she could not rationalize. After a fortnight, Sarah and Nina discovered that their room had a history. Through conversations with a senior student who had lived in the building quite some time ago, they learned that a female student had once occupied the room, living in isolation and under extreme stress, obsessed with keeping control of her environment and terrified of leaving it. That student had disappeared from official records after a few months, and while no official cause of death or incident was recorded, rumors among older alumni spoke of her refusing to leave the dorm, of her obsessive behaviors, and of reports that objects in her room would move inexplicably. Sarah began to realize that these occurrences she was documenting, the meticulous, subtle disturbances, mirrored the patterns attributed to that student, and that the presence they were experiencing was not just random, but attached to the room itself. It was at this time that her and Nina stopped trying to rationalize the anomalies away and began treating them as serious, even if they didn't fully understand the nature of what they were encountering. One evening, after a long day of classes, Sarah returned to her room to find a notebook that she had left on the corner of her desk. Now had been opened to a page she had never written in. There were small marks, almost like indentations, as if something had pressed on the pages from above, but nothing in the room could have caused it. He showed it to Nina, and although Nina remained skeptical of any supernatural explanation, she admitted that she too felt a tension in the air, a presence that seemed focused on Sarah alone, as though the room itself had a consciousness that preferred her company to any other. That night, Sarah slept lightly, half aware of the subtle movements around her bed, of the quiet, almost imperceptible brush of air that accompanied nothing physical. But the room gave no dramatic visuals or auditory clues. It was the kind of presence that weighed on her without manifesting it in a way that could be easily captured or explained. As the days went on, the disturbances in the room became harder for Sarah to ignore. It wasn't sudden or exaggerated, but persistent, and often occurred in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. Sarah would leave the room for classes or meals and return to find her textbooks stacked differently than she remembered. Small personal items like a water bottle or keys placed on top of papers she hadn't touched, or a pen she had left on the floor now lying on her bedspread. These were small things, insignificant on their own, but over time they became impossible to dismiss, especially because they always happened in her absence. And Nina, despite her skepticism, started noticing them too. She would enter the room after Sarah had stepped out and remark, "Did you move this? Or did it move itself?" And although she would laugh nervously, there was an edge in her voice that betrayed unease. It was late one Thursday evening when the first significant encounter happened. Sarah had been working on a psychology paper, and the desk lamp's light flickered in a subtle, deliberate rhythm as if syncing to her movements. She placed her laptop down for a moment to stretch, and glancing at her notebook, realized that the pages she had carefully written in were now filled with faint indentations. She froze, trying to convince herself it was an impression from the pen on the previous page, but the marks were precise, deliberate, and oriented towards her. Nina, sitting across the room on the futon, looked up from her coding assignment and said nothing. Sarah could feel her tension. Neither one of them spoke, yet both understood that something in the room was actively drawing attention to Sarah alone. For the next hour, Sarah sat motionless, carefully documenting everything on her phone, knowing that whatever presence existed was aware she was recording. The next day, the dorm's historical records yielded more unsettling information. The student who had once occupied the room had been a meticulous note taker, writing about her life in obsessive detail. Her journal, now archived in the university's library, included references to objects moving, books falling, and what she described as a watching wait in the room. Sarah read these accounts and realized with a chill that the modern day disturbances mirrored the historical records almost exactly, down to the timing and the type of interactions with her belongings. It was no longer simply an eerie coincidence. Presence in the room had a history, and that history was reaching out in its subtle, precise ways. Over the following weeks, the activity escalated. Sarah began walking in the middle of the night to the faint but unmistakable sound of papers being shuffled on her desk. Even when Nina was asleep beside her, not just books or pens, but her entire study material seemed to be nudged, rearranged, and sometimes stacked in ways that conveyed pattern or intent rather than random movement. The most unnerving part was the presence seemed to have a form of awareness, almost like it could perceive Sarah's attention. The room felt different depending on her focus. When she was distracted by homework or conversation, minor disturbances occurred. But the moment she turned her attention fully to the anomalies, the activity became pronounced, almost as if responding. It wasn't threatening in dramatic, cinematic way, but controlling and measured. Lights would flicker just at the edge of her vision. Items would shift in ways that forced her to turn and acknowledge them, and when she moved towards them to examine them, you would often find nothing tangible, only the impression that the room itself has reacted to her approach. By the third week, Sarah's behavior began subtly shifting. She became more cautious, measured in her movement, and hyper aware of her surroundings. She started sleeping with her journal beside her, recording everything she noticed immediately upon waking, including details as minor as the position of a book on the desk or the angle of her laptop screen. Nina, once skeptical, joined in, sometimes confirming or questioning the occurrences. They both agreed to avoid leaving the room unmonitored for long periods, and Sarah installed a small camera on her desk to create a record of patterns she could analyze later. It was during this period that they made the most startling observation, reviewing hours of footage from the camera They noticed that objects shifted only when Sarah was out of the room or not directly looking at them, and the movements often formed patterns. Books stacked in neat rows, notes aligned in grids, pens oriented perfectly along paper edges. It was not chaotic, not random, but very organized. The room seemed to respond to her absence with careful precision, and once she returned, the room returned to the state of apparently normalcy. Sarah felt increasingly tense whenever she left her desk or turned her back. Even ordinary movements felt charged, as if the room itself anticipated her actions. Nina, on the other hand, who had maintained a skeptical distance for most of the month, now openly admitted that she could feel the same pressure, the same subtle attentiveness. One evening, while they were reviewing their documented footage, Sarah noticed the pens on her desk had been repositioned in the same meticulous alignment as the older student's record described it. That was the moment they both realized, and now they'd need to do something about it. They discussed their options calmly but with urgency. Neither wanted to sensationalize or dramatize the events, they simply wanted to regain control of their daily lives. After consulting with a local expert, someone who had studied the historical dome records and patterns of reported paranormal activity, they received practical advice. The presence seemed attached to the room itself, and the safest resolution was to remove themselves from the environment entirely. Within the next few days, Sarah and Nina packed their belongings with care, documenting everything once more before leaving. They moved into another dorm, one modern and newly renovated, with no historical incidents or odd reports. Almost immediately, the subtle disturbances stopped. The item stayed in place, the lamp functioned normally, and the heavy attentiveness that had dominated Sarah's evening disappeared. Neither girl experienced the precise, measured activity again. Sarah kept her journal and notes, which she eventually shared with the dorm administration and local archives, so the future students would know about the room's history. She never revisited the room in person and avoided the dorm stories and conversation, preferring instead to focus on her studies. Nina, equally shaken, returned to her routine, carrying with her a subtle unease about old buildings, patterns, and spaces that could retain memory in ways she didn't fully understand.